Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Thompson and Mr. William Lassiter. Today we're going to be discussing the chapter in the Silmarillion on, or titled rather, of Eldamar and the Princes of the Eldalia. And so where we left off previously was with Thingol and Melian, which is a brief side story, which is later developed was further developed a little bit later in the Silmarillion, and it's in the midst of this process of the elves moving west to go to Valinor, because the Valar have decided, okay, we should bring everybody. We're afraid of the elves being left out in the dark, in the cold. We'll invite them to Valinor to join us, and they send a couple of emissaries, they're princes, they come back, and they begin leading the people, leading the various nations of elves along the way. Now, there's a group that follows Thingol, and they kind of go aside to wait around for him to come out of his Sleeping Beauty kind of enchantment with Melian. And then the Vanyar and the Noldor continue west. Right, so they're moving west, and that's where we pick up our story today. And I want to set the scene by reading maybe the first paragraph here, and we should begin to look into what's going on here. I think this really sets solidly the placement of some of the three main branches of elves: the Vanyar, Noldor, and the Teleri, for us. And that's going to be pivotal for what comes later, as we'll see these various main characters arise out of or from these three principal branches of the elves. And that's important. The distinction between them is important when it comes to understanding the conflicts that unfold for essentially the rest of the plot of the Silmarillion. So, in time, the hosts of the Vanyar and the Noldor came to the last western shores of the Hitherlands. In the north, these shores, in the ancient days after the Battle of the Powers, bent ever westward, until in the northernmost parts of Arda only a narrow sea divided Aman, upon which Valinor was built, from the Hitherland. But this narrow sea was filled with grinding ice, because of the violence of the frosts of Melkor. Therefore Orome did not lead the hosts of the Eldalia into the far north, but he brought them to the fair lands about the river Sirion, that afterwards were named Beleriand. And from those shores, whence first the Eldar looked in fear and wonder on the sea there stretched in ocean, wide and dark and deep, between them and the mountains of Amma. So, one thing for your awareness, to note the grinding ice in the northern sea. That's important because certain special somebodies take a long trek over the icy north to come back to Middle-earth at a certain point in the future, but we'll get to that. It's just something to bear in mind. The Valar decided not to lead them up in that way, which would be very close to Morgoth's lair, Melkor's, where he's chained now, where he's residing right now. Torturous, chaotic, frozen waters grinding against each other, but rather take them down to the fair, warm lands around the river Sirion, which we now later know as Beleriand, and then to take them west from there. Question is, how do they get to Valar from those hither shores? Will, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? What happens next, and why is that an interesting thing?
Well, how do they get to Valar? There's this whole thing about an island, isn't there?
Mhm.
It Ulmo steps in, if I remember right. So,
He does.
yeah.
Ulmo the Absent, following the various councils of the Valar, he's sometimes shows up, sometimes doesn't. But he's got this predilection for the elves for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Ulmo, again, this is tapping my sparse knowledge, but isn't Ulmo the Lord of the Deeps? He's the Lord of the Waters, if I remember
He
right.
is.
Is that right? Yeah.
He is.
So,
And as we I was going to say, as we discussed in the previous episode too, he's close. He's the one who's closest to the, as it were, the beating heart of human and elf-ish suffering. Right? He's got his finger on the pulse because he's all tears are made of water and all tears flow to the sea.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, and this is a really interesting connection on why he would take such interest in them. But my understanding is that Ulmo is very concerned with him, and so he comes to the Eldar, and he basically makes an island, if I'm not mistaken. Here's the line is Ulmo uprooted an island which long had stood alone amid the sea, far from either shore since the tumults of the fall of Iluin, and with the aid of his servants he moved it, as it were a mighty ship, and anchored it in the bay of Valar, into which Sirion poured his water. Then the Vanyar and the Noldar embarked upon that isle, and were drawn over the sea, and came at last to the long shores beneath the mountains of Aman. And they entered Valinor, and were welcomed to its bliss. So he gets an island, and he puts them on this island, or they get on the island, and they sail across to the lands of the Undying Lands. Partly because they don't make ships right. They don't do ships yet, and so there's
It
no
hasn't been
no
invented.
real way to
Yeah.
cross over the water. And so the god has to step in, Will has to step in and create this floating island. And it's harkening back to very old Irish and I think Celtic tradition here. You see in those stories floating islands that are disconnected from land. And the skeptic would say, yeah, that doesn't happen. Islands are, part of Earth and they have to come up from this, they don't break off, blah, 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 blah. But you just got to say, okay, just pause there in your rational world for a minute and just go with it. He made an island and the island floated around and he carried the people across. And it was sort of what do you call it? A miraculous thing. Deus ex machina that comes out of here and carries the elves across. But for me, it's kind of like talking about the origin stories of any of these cultures. Like the Jews say, well, these pillars underneath the earth, and there's water on either side, and it's surrounded like a bubble. And modern science tells us that's not true. But you have to back up a minute and say, well, we're not doing modern science here. This is mythology. This is a story that talks about how do we emerge? Where do we come from? The elves got on a floating island and they came across to the Undying Land. So I find it interesting too that Ulmo would find that as his method. Why doesn't he like? This sounds weird, but why doesn't he like get sea creatures to take them across?
Why don't
Why
they
doesn't he
ride
just build?
dolphins?
Why doesn't he make ships for them or to show them the craft of making ships? I think in some ways because you're going to see people making ships, you're going to see people later on making ships to come across to the Undying Lands when they ought not to do so.
Right.
That's the Númenóreans later on when they make their huge attack against the Undying Lands, or try to make a huge attack. They make a fleet of ships, a whole armada they bring across. And I think that this is a direct contrast to that. The elves don't make they don't make tools, they don't make machines to sail across the water. They
Mhm.
accept what the god gives them, and that's how they get to the Undying. I wonder if it isn't a direct contrast to what comes later, where men, the elf men, where they make machines to conquer the waves, and therefore sail across in their armada, their fleet, to attack the Undying. I'm thinking maybe.
I think that's a very interesting contrast, and I think you're right with that. Um, they come to the shores in response to the summons, and Ulmo figures out a way to move them. He uproots an island. Now, I have been on a floating island. This is possible. These things do happen. In fact, there's a whole, I hesitate to call it a civilization lacking proper cities, but there's a whole culture upon the shores, not the shores, the surface of Lake Titicaca that dwell entirely on floating islands. Now, these islands are made of millennia of reed boats, woven onto one another, and the reeds continually growing, being laid down. But such a thing is possible. In that respect, we could also point out that they call it an island. What else would you call it? Maybe not another name for it, but even the theory of plate tectonics and continental
Mm,
drift is that not precisely it? Land moving across the waters. So I think that's possible, but I think an interesting aspect of that too is that you've got. I mean, how are the elves situated then if they get onto the island?
mm,
Um, is that they're suspended between heaven and the seas, between deep and deep. They're on land, suspended between deep and deep. So they're not there by any artifice of man. They're on an island, not a boat. But they transition across, not in a mechanical way, but the earth, they're almost on a mini world. It's a microcosm of sorts, right? Because if
mm,
the whole of the Middle Earth is itself land surrounded by the sea, they're taken off on a miniature version of that, scale model. And so that way, it's almost as though the whole world is moving across together.
mm.
And I think there's a lot there to reflect on in terms of this liminal space that they're dwelling in, the in between. Right? They're dwelling in the midst of the
Yeah.
waters below and the waters above. And in that way, they're almost cocooned or in an egg of sorts, metaphorically speaking, a mystical egg moving across to come to Valinor in that way. And that's not without significance, right? Being in an egg or a womb or cuddled in some sort of protective gear, like they're infants, being moved from one place to
Mm.
another
Yes.
to come to the light, and it
Yes.
doesn't
And it's
require
very,
too much of them.
mhm. It's very similar to the story that we have in Genesis of the book of Noah, the story of Noah and how
Exactly.
Noah he creates an ark, and it's called an ark, and it's made out of gopher wood from the area of Gopher. But he's got every creature on the planet in that ark, and they live there for a long period of time, and it's a small community that has to get along with each other. So at the end of it, when they open up the ark, it disgorges its contents onto the earth again, and the creatures go and populate the earth again. Which again, the skeptic would say, well, that's not scientific. Not the point. The point is that you're dealing with a little mini world, as you said. The ark itself in Genesis is a mini world, and all those creatures in there could, you say, be like they're similar to ideas in the head of a single person who travels across to safety from the flood waters, which is a similar image to what we're having here. The whole world covered in water and held between the waters and the waters. So you get a similar story in the story of Genesis. And I think both that story and this story are talking about, as you said, this being held in a liminal realm between earth, between water and sky, or between water and water, if you will. It reminds me a great deal of an image out of the American epic, The American Nightmare, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, where the little
Yeah.
cabin boy gets kicked, he gets knocked overboard, and he's suspended in the ocean for several hours. Find him, and when they drag him out, he's nuts. He's gone insane. He can't handle the being held in complete suspension between heaven and earth, or between heaven and waters. He can't handle that. The terra firma has gone out from under his feet. And for us, whether we acknowledge it or not, this is still it's a highly symbolic state of existence that we walk on the earth. That's what we call terra firma. So glad to be there on terra firma. We kiss the ground when we get off of a bad boat ride or off of a bad airplane ride, and we're glad to be in this land here. For us,
Hmm.
being on the water is still a highly symbolic experience of being held between the heavens and the waters, the chaos and the chaos, if you will. So, yeah, I think that this is very much an image of these elves traveling liminally through the waters and the waters. It's also, I got to say, reflective of or echoing the mystical sleep that comes upon Adam when he's put under sleep, and then Eve is drawn out of his rib, which itself is a mystical sleep like the mystical sleep that we see originally there with Fingal and Melian. And when he falls in love with her, and all time just kind of passes by, that
Hmm.
mystical sleep that occurs there is an ecstasy, but it's also it's like a new creation comes out of it. Something new after that mystical period of being in the pod, being in the womb, if you will. So yeah, there's a lot
Hmm.
going on here. There's one last thing, if I could share here. This is I did let me I'm gonna have a hard time sharing it with you, but I can put it up later. I found this awesome website called from the Loader Project, and it's a map, an interactive map of Middle Earth, and it's really quite keen. Um, so let me see here. I should probably call this up somewhere else. But it shows us that there's a little shard that breaks off from the island when it's going across, and that little shard actually remains behind for quite some time afterwards until the later inundation I'm thinking. And
Hmm.
this little shard, it says here in the text, the eastern horn of the island, deep grounded in the shoals off the mouths of Siram, was broken asunder and remained behind. And that is, it is said, was the Isle of Valar, to which afterwards Osea often came. To which Osea often came. So that's kind of a neat little touch there. That just a little bit of the land remained behind, and you tried to pull the island off, and a little piece stayed behind, kind of. But it was almost as
Hmm.
though the whole of the Elvish world traveled into a dreamlike state to go to the Undying Lands, but just a little
Exactly.
bit remained behind in the conscious realm still, which I find it
Hmm.
kind of a neat little image.
It is, and it actually sets up what the paragraph that follows afterwards, because not all of the elves make it onto the island boat.
Yeah.
There's the Teleri remain still in Middle Earth because they had with this is it reads in some sense we could mistake this for thinking that it's day over day these things are happening very quickly or maybe in the span of a couple of hours, but really as they came over, we're talking years and years. Elves can take their time, they're immortal. Their sense of time is very different from ours even in their earlier days, and so they're dwelling by the shores, so they're dwelling inland from the shores, and so on. And so they're settled, right? They're not just nomadic pastoralists that are going directly and following, although some may be. But the next paragraph tells us that the Teleri remained still in Middle Earth. So Noldor, the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. The Teleri remained still in Middle Earth, for they dwelt in East Beleriand, far from the sea, and did not hear the summons of Ulmo until too late.
Hmm.
Many of them were still searching for Elwë, their lord, Elwë Singol, who we later call Thingol, right, who's with Melian. They're still looking for him because he's in the enchanted wood, mystically hidden from them. And so without him, they were unwilling to go any further. So then they didn't hear the call, they didn't hear the train whistle until it was already departed, essentially. And so
They missed the
they
boat.
literally missed the boat, except island, because what this is
Yeah.
interesting because there's a way in which that itself continues to play out in their, let's call it their national story, because they become the great boat builders,
Hmm.
both those that stay, some of them even stay on the hither shore, and that's where we get Círdan, the shipwright, who builds ships at the behest of the Valar, essentially. And so it's not to conquer the waves like the Numenorians do, but he utilizes this technology in a good and blessed way. Really he comes into play much, much later, but he's mentioned in this chapter. Um, and then on the further shore, in Elvenhome, over by Valinor, they're actually dwelling on the seas over there, and dwelling on the shores rather over there, and they build the great ships, and they're the seafaring peoples of the elves in that way, and they learn the craft of shipbuilding, perhaps to
Hmm.
make up for, not to make up for, but out of recognizing that that gap, that hollow space, that helplessness of, hey, we missed the boat. We're not going to do that. We're going to make our own boat. There's a
Hmm.
sense, but it's not something contrary to nature. It's an evolution of their nature.
Right.
Um, so they're sticking around on the shores of Beleriand. They come down to the shore once they hear that they've missed the boat, essentially. They come and dwell by the shores of Beleriand, by the mouths of Sirion, longing for their friends that had departed, the Noldor and the Vanyar. And they took Olwe, who was Elwë's brother, to be their king, because Elwë is off with Melian. So long they remained on the coast of the Western Sea, and Osse and Uinen came to them and befriended them. Osse instructed them, sitting upon a rock near to the margin of land, and from him they learned all manner of sea lore and sea music. Right, the original teacher of the sea shanties.
Mm.
Thus it came to be that the Teleri, that's basically everything Irish right there, sea lore and sea music. Thus it came that the Teleri, who were from the beginning lovers of water, and the fairest singers of all the elves, still all Irish, were thereafter enamored of the seas, and their songs were filled with the sound of waves upon the shore.
Yeah, that's an
And
interesting
so
image, isn't it?
they're brought to the edge now. They weren't quite close enough, and then they hear the summons and they arrive too late, and then they linger by the shores nonetheless. But that's the opportunity then for them to learn from these lesser gods, the lower level gods,
Yeah.
these things of the sea, and they fall in love with the sea. And
Yeah,
Ulmo
and
ultimately does come to get them and bring them over, but he does so at the intercession of the Noldor, who are already over in Valinor. They say, "Hey, we really miss the Teleri. Could you go back and get them?" And eventually he does.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that image there where it says, first off, that they're enamored of the sea and their songs are filled with the sound of waves upon the shore. Not quite sure what that sounds like, but that's a really neat image.
It
Is
is.
it, I wonder if that isn't, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what that would sound like. Maybe like crescendos of waves or even rising music. I'm not really sure. Or maybe it's the
Yeah.
rhythmic pattern itself. It's hard to say. Um, it certainly isn't the sort of the driving music of the modern world. Like talk about jazz music being the driving machine-like rhythmic sound to it.
Hmm.
Not that I dislike jazz. I love jazz, but it's a
Sure.
different sound than, say, the lilting of the sea shanty, like you mentioned, or the singing of the lullaby, of Irish lullabies or something like that. It's a different sound to it and a different rhythmic pattern as well. So that's kind of
Hmm.
neat to hear. Speaking on that for just a minute, when I hear a lot of these different renditions of Tolkien's poetry, there are some lousy stuff out there, I gotta say. But there's some very good stuff too. And there's the one called, I think, the Tolkien Orchestra, and they put a number of these tunes that Tolkien wrote to music. And the neat thing is they
Yeah.
do their research. They try to do them in the styles, for instance, of the Byzantine Empire. Or they try to do them in the styles of Irish and Celtic culture. And they're quite lovely to hear. Really well
Hmm.
done. One in particular, which I think I shared with you, was the version that they do of Namarie, that
Hmm.
song of longing that the elves sing. And they said it in a way, it sounds very Celtic. It sounds like something out of Wales or something like that. It's
Hmm.
out of Ireland. So what the Teleri sing, I think you can imagine it being closely associated with the sea. But if you want a sense of what it's like, I would say listen to Irish music. Listen to not the jigs and reels, but more the lilts and the lullabies and the shanties.
Hmm.
Far more of that crooning sound of longing for the sea. But I also think about the making of boats. Um, boats are that's a very interesting image there because a boat is a machine. It's true, but it's not the same type of machine as, say, an automobile, or
Hmm.
a generator. Not quite the same. And this is we're talking an era before motorboats. I mean, Tolkien lived in an era of motorboats, but the elves don't invent high-speed motorboats. That's not what they're doing. They're more like
Right.
canoes and paddle boats and things like that. So quiet. And if you've ever been out on the water in the morning in a canoe or paddle boat, and
Hmm.
that whole sound of dipping into the water and of hearing the nature around you and the rising of the sun over the water, there's a certain mystical experience that I think is very elvish in its nature. It
Yeah,
is
there is
not
very
the
much.
same thing as a motorboat tooling around with a skier behind it or something like that. Um,
No. In fact, for an extended meditation on that, that's, Romano Guardini writes this. This
mm,
is how his letters from Lake Como begins. Is this meditation, and he doesn't really know where to take it ultimately. He wants to be optimistic about technology, and at the same time worried about it, and he's inconclusive, really. As I think a lot of people take him further than he's willing to go himself.
yeah.
Um, but he does explicitly this. He's sitting on the shores of Lake Como, looking out on the water, and he sees the first motorboats. In that they're essentially sailboats with a motor, and he says that is goddamn pointless. Why do you still have a sail on them? Like you got a boat, it's a motor, it's nothing but you're nothing but a screeching and a noise when all's said and done. You know,
Yeah,
it's
right, right,
just
right, right.
the boat
And
works just fine with a sail, but now you've put a motor on it and it
yeah,
does nothing but disrupt things, and it doesn't necessarily make it more efficient.
and we're
But I
talking
want
this era too. We're talking this era
to
too, about the same time. Romano
same
Guardini is
time,
about the same time.
same time. He starts writing those in the 30s, I think.
Yeah, right. And again, going back to this image that Tolkien's bringing up of the fall and the machine, uh, the machine world is, we live in it. We have to accept it. There's a lot of advantages to it, but it is a dominating of the world, not a working with the world. And that's a really good distinction
Yeah.
when you see a boat. The boats, sailboats and paddle boats and canoes and the like work with the world. It's like you have to harness the wind. You have to harness the force of your own arms in the water. When you put a motor onto the end of the rowboat, suddenly you're not harnessing anything aside from just gasoline energy. You're really plowing through it. I mean, you're dominating. Now, that's not necessarily a bad quote unquote thing. It's just a different thing.
Hmm.
The dominating of the universe is a different experience than the harnessing of the energy of the universe. That's that's made that's made pretty clear there in Bardini and elsewhere.
Hmm.
So
I think you're right.
elves harness the power.
That's just it. And even when you think about like what is a boat at the end of the day, it's living wood
Yeah.
that's been reshaped. So it's the body of a tree. You dwell inside of a tree while you're living on the waters. You're dwelling inside. You're embraced by
Mm.
trees floating upon them.
Mm.
So and the whole mystical nature of trees, especially in the mind of Tolkien, is bound up with that. So you're dwelling, so wood, right? You take wood, that's a tree, and you've
Mm.
shaped it, bent it, um, bound many of them together, and you've got them, and you're floating upon the waters, moved by the winds, right? Moved by the
Mm.
breath, the air.
Mm.
You, in many ways, uniting the different elements together in the boat. And I think you're exactly right. You're driven by the wind. You're moved by the wind or human power if you have to row, but really for the most part you harness the wind that's moving and you blow where the spirit listeth, right? I mean
Mm.
you're being moved as it goes. And you can adapt. You can't change the wind, but you can adapt how you relate to the movement of the wind
Right.
to tack this way or that to continue to
Right.
move in the direction you want to. But it's about a dance with the elements rather
Hmm. Hmm.
than ripping the cord and just blasting right through it, for
Hmm.
better or for worse. That's what you're doing then. And I
Yeah.
think you're
Yeah.
right. It's absolutely two different things, two very different experiences.
There's another thing about that too, which I just thought of. The living wood idea. When you're in a wooden boat, there's a lot of give. The wood is it flexes. And when you walk
Yeah.
on it or move on it, it flexes. Metal boats, which come later, are not the same thing at all. The times that I've been either in small metal craft or else in the larger metal craft, Navy boats, most of the people that work on those things say you got to have special shoes, and it still takes a toll on your legs because you're walking on metal all the time. It hurts like crazy if you're not used to it, because there's no give to metal. It's a hard substance that has been wrestled by humans to become what it is. So I find that kind of interesting. The other thing I find interesting too is the way the craft is handed down and the way the craft forms the culture. Here, Tolkien says that God teaches them how to do this. That Ulmo teaches them this whole craft, and it frames their whole way of thinking, not dominating but working with nature. The Vikings used to say that the crafters of ships were like shamans. Could look at a tree and be able to pick out what the shape was that they could use for the crafting
Mhm.
of boats. And those same guys then became the architects that built these amazing stave churches in the shape of essentially a boat, is what they were. These churches were essentially boats.
Mhm.
And the same thing happens. You even see it in the Odyssey. The fact that Odysseus and his men came from a culture where they observed or were themselves creators of boats allowed
Mhm.
them then to escape from the Cyclops because they take what is essentially a mast of a ship and they harden it the way you would harden a mast of a ship, and then they plunge it into the eye of the Cyclops, which allows them to escape from this creature of chaos and barbarism. They even say that Odysseus is going to die only after he has gone north and found a people that don't know that he's carrying an oar. They think it's a winnowing fan. In other words, find a people that have no relation to the sea. And there you plant that oar in the ground, and then you go back and you can pass on. You die then.
Hmm.
So even there, the whole imagery of being able to build a boat crafts what the nature of the culture is, who they are as a people. Not because they're dominating, but because they know how to work with nature in order to be able to navigate through the world. So there's a lot of that, I think, in this that forms the culture of the Teleri.
And so after many years, Ulmo comes at the behest of the Noldor. They're grieved at the long sundering from the Teleri, and they want the Ulmo to go bring the Teleri to Aman if they would come. And so he comes over to say, "Well, you guys want to come?" And they, yeah, many of them were willing indeed at this point. You know, they realize they missed the boat and they've been waiting for Ulmo to come back. And here's an interesting thing. But great was the grief of Osse when Ulmo returned to the coasts of Beleriand to bear the Teleri away to Valinor. For his care, Osse's care, was for the seas of Middle Earth and the shores of the Hitherlands. Remember, in the taxonomy of the gods, the Valar, Ulmo is the god of the sea, and
Mm,
his specific royal domain is the deeps. But there are other. He's got a whole army of assistants, right? He's got many associated gods. Some of them with the springs and the rivers and the streams, others with the shores, others, specifically calm or storms at sea, that kind of thing. And Osse is the god who's the shallows, right? He deals with the shallows, the shores that, again, a liminal space between the
mm,
sea proper and the land. And so he's living there. And that was his care, and he was very disappointed that the voices of the Teleri should no longer be heard in his domain. He did
mm,
persuade some of them to remain. They called themselves the Falathrim, the elves of the Falas, who in after days had dwellings in the havens of Brithenbar and Eglarast, and the first mariners in Middle Earth, and the first makers of ships. And Círdan the shipwright was their lord.
and for the record, Círdan is the character that shows up in Lord of the Rings later on when they do go to the Grey Havens. This is the same guy
Exactly.
at the beginning of the world, basically.
At the very
He's
beginning
kind
of
of
the
old.
world. And exactly, he's ancient. And he and his people stay there not out of laziness, not out of rejection of the gods, but because they're particularly faithful to this
Mm,
one minor deity who says, I'd really like to have some of the Teleri stay here and sing songs. We could sing songs together on the shores.
mm,
And so they do. And that's and of course they play a pivotal role later on in helping elves who leave Middle Earth to go to
mhm,
the Undying Lands. When we're talking
mhm.
late Second, Third Age, Fourth Age for that matter, even.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
What? Why? This is a question maybe for later on, but why do the elves continue to leave Middle Earth? Why don't they just why don't the ones that stay there just stay there? It seems like, especially during the age of the War of the Ring, it's said
Mhm.
frequently the elves are leaving. They're all going west. Why did they do that? Why don't they just stay there in Middle Earth?
I mean, I think, to again put some perspective for our listeners who are not as familiar with the timelines, there's thousands and thousands of years. I mean, between now, this point, and the time when Numenor is a thing. And there's thousands and thousands of years, where the elves come back to Middle Earth. The elves are in Middle Earth for a long time. Even the elves that have gone to Valinor, after thousands of years, they make their way. Some of them, many of them, a large host of them in particular, makes their way back to Middle Earth. That's kind of the real drama of the Silmarillion, and they
Hmm.
inhabit and populate and fill Middle Earth again, and they're there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And really, we're talking long, long time, millennia, to the point where we get to Lord of the Rings. So they've been in Middle Earth for a long time. Now they're also elves
Yeah.
like Legolas's ancestors, so who never made it to Valinor in the first place. we'll hear about them. They're the ones who stay around with Elwë, the close kin of Elwë, who are still looking for him, waiting for him to awake. Um, and there's something of the sea longing in them, something that draws them imperceptibly towards the divine. Right? I mean, that's this. They feel this instinctual impulse, like a bird migrating south in the winter, or north again in the spring. They're drawn somehow into the west, and you know, and there's a whole story of that in different ways. But I think one thing that's left open in Lord of the Rings is, for example, the fate of Celeborn. He tarries. Galadriel goes, at the end of Lord of the Rings, we know they go. In the appendices, we find out that Legolas eventually makes his way back over, and he brings Gimli with him, the first and only dwarf to go and dwell in the Undying Lands. But it's mentioned in the appendices specifically that Celeborn tarries even longer in Middle-earth, and we're not really sure what happens to him. So it leaves it open, explicitly mentions him, to leave open-ended the possibility that Celeborn himself is perhaps still tarrying in Middle-earth. Whether he goes back or not is undetermined, as far as I'm aware, and that it could be the case for others as well, which I think Tolkien has to have there, because of course we have stories and legends of elves and fairies in this world, and he mentions in more than one place, even in The Hobbit, that elves dwell sort of secretly at the edges of forests, and it's in the present tense, speaking to our times, right, in the properly modern world, 20th century, and so there's a sense that there's still a haunting presence of elves, but that they seed the way to the age of man. I guess that's kind of the setup, right, in Lord of the Rings. But it's not abandoned. I don't think. Some people have interpreted this whole idea, trying to draw parallels or connections between Wagner and Tolkien. In Tolkien himself, it was like, okay, right. So there's a word ring involved in both. That's about where the comparison ends.
There's some dragons.
To be fair, he's some dragons. He's a little cantankerous about it because there's a bit more connection, but he's telling a story very differently. And I can't remember who this was, but I was reading some commentator on this, and they read it perhaps even a bit more pessimistic or melancholically than Tolkien. Admittedly, a bit more melancholic person, outlook, perspective on the world. I think they take it a little bit more pessimistically than even Tolkien would go, and saying, but at the end of the day, for Tolkien too, the elves all leave Middle-earth. There's no more enchantment here. And they take Weber's thesis of the Ensaubildung as sort of a matter of course, like, well, that's the natural way of things, and it's got to be that way. That we've progressed, so it still buys into this sort of progressivist cosmology, this notion of history, and I don't think that that's true, because in Tolkien's work you've got much more of a conflictual relationship between elvishness, let's say, and the machine. And if the whole thing, as we've been tracking, is about the fall mortality of the machine, it's not a matter of course that for example, that the Shire becomes an industrial wasteland. And in fact, that's a thing that can be undone, as Frodo and company actually achieve.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and even that path, you're absolutely right about that thing about the machine there. Even the big machine of the Lord of the Rings, which is the ring. Even there, Gandalf says to Frodo that a hobbit free of the ring for a certain period of time, one could guess, would heal from that. So there could be healing from this thing. Yeah, I don't know if the whole pessimism thing. I think it reflects more on the viewer than the actual material. My dad used to talk about this when he was getting on in years, before he died. He talked about how he had that feeling, the elves leaving, but he said that they never completely go away. And Dad always talked cryptically, so I didn't understand half the shit he said, but because he was very, deep waters and all that. But he was a very perceptive guy, and I think he was onto something about how it's more about the experience of the elves leaving Middle Earth and the sort of longing, the Namarie thing that goes on there, than it is a fact that of inevitability that they're all going to leave, and you're just going to be stuck with this kind of barbarous world of the machine afterwards. I don't think that was what Tolkien was getting at. In fact, I think if I'm not mistaken, he had planned to have the Dagor Dagorloth, the Ragnarok thing before his world, Middle Earth, became that total machine. So he was saying that the world's going to end long before we get to that point, so to speak. So I don't think he was quite as pessimistic either, but I think he was very aware of the idea that there are these experiences of elves leaving the world, so to
Mhm.
speak. Um, and that image of the machine too. If the machine is not an inevitable thing, it's a helpful thing. It certainly has done some good to help human beings live better, but it's neither a fetish. It can't be a fetish, and it's not the inevitable end all and be all of human history, progress and all that. It's not the inevitable end of human history. What is interesting is that it keeps creeping in as a temptation to use that control or that domination over the world, almost a natural temptation in some ways, because it makes sense to do this way, to drive down to the Piggly Wiggly rather than having the Piggly Wiggly within your neighborhood so you could walk to it.
Mhm.
It kind of makes sense in a way, but it's not an inevitability. It's why,
Mhm.
for instance, I'm really kind of interested in the building of this city that they do here later on in the text of Tyrion. Like, why
Mhm.
would they build a city? Elves. It's a strange thing to me because elves live under the stars, don't they? And they live under the trees. So why would they feel the need to build this city? But maybe I should hold off on that for just a minute and
Let's hold off on
focus
that.
on
And I
that.
want to just this theme of going west and the elves leaving, pessimism, not pessimism. One thing that this image that I have in my mind here is, let's or I want to say I want to share, and then relate that to something that we see in two possible endings for Bilbo. Right,
Mm,
the two possible last songs that we hear from Bilbo.
okay.
If those of you who didn't follow us through our romp through the Hobbit, go back to the chat, go back to our episode there, where we talk about where Bilbo learns to sing the first song properly, not just a taunting rhyme against the spiders. But when they're coming back and he sees the Shire for the first time, so the roads go ever on and so on. Now we turn to hills and trees they long have
Right.
known. Right, so
That's
this is a
right.
significant development of the plot and of his character is the indication that he can sing now. So there's
Mhm.
something different about you after all, Bilbo says Gandalf. Something has changed. He's become elf-like in some way.
Yes.
Singing is the mark of that. Okay. Now, that's why we've got two possible things for Bilbo's last song. We'll get to that in a second. Here's the scene. So the elves are hopping on this island, and Ulmo is going to move them along. Now, let's remember, there is no sun and there is no moon. They dwell
Right.
entirely under the stars. So this dark sky filled with stars, beautiful, but no real single source of light,
Mhm.
no luminary, no massive luminary. And they're moving along towards the west, and where we normally experience a sunrise, right across the waters, if you've ever seen it, it's nothing to compare with it. And instead of the sun rising, as they move closer to Valinor, they behold the light of the trees for the first time. And
Mm.
this is a million times brighter than our sun here in this world ever could be. And they come upon this. And so, in many ways, as they're moving along, probably with some speed, it's like they come upon a swift sunrise.
Mm.
And so, which is how the Lord of the Rings ends, right? Frodo saw, as they're
That's
going
right.
along, there was a bright green country under a swift sunrise. This is the elves' first experience of Valinor. They see this like us, except they don't have a metaphor for a sunrise. There's no analogy. The sun hasn't been invented yet, right? And so they see the bright lights, and it just appears to them over the horizon as it were as they go. Now, okay, given that, there's debate among critics of not interpreters but critics of Tolkien's work that say, he ought to have done this, he ought to have done that, criticizing his literary skill. And there are people who do not like Bilbo's last song, which is a standalone poem that Tolkien wrote later. It was sort of pieced together from his other manuscripts. It was never published really early, but Christopher Tolkien, brings it forward. Um, and people have criticized it, saying, "Well, what is this last thing? It's essentially something that Bilbo sings as he's getting on the boat with
Right.
Frodo and Gandalf and Elrond. They're going to sail across to the Undying Lands, right? And as it's not recorded in the Red Book, presumably because Frodo didn't hear it and all that, it's something, or that, not Frodo, but Sam didn't hear it, who finishes the Red Book. But it's something that comes to us from elsewhere. Tolkien wrote this, right? And it's, the people criticize this. They say, oh, it's really simplistic. It's trying to add like this nice, sweet ending to Bilbo, where Tolkien should have left off Bilbo's last song being the last thing he sings sort of to himself in Rivendell when Frodo's leaving or about to leave on the quest, which ends with, now I think of times, it's a when I was young, when I was middle-aged, and now I'm old. And essentially it's now I'm sitting by the fire. I sit beside the fire and think of times that used to be, or, times that will come again. And, when there will come a spring that I will never see, for there are so many different, every spring has a different green, and there are things that there's always so much more to see. But I think of how winter is coming, and there's going to come a spring someday that I will never see. And now I wait for the sound of steps, coming to the door and all that. And it's the song of an old man who is no longer an adventurer, resigning himself and retiring down. And they say, that's where it should have ended, because that's real. And it is good, and it is real, but it's not the end for Tolkien. The elves aren't all leaving.
Right.
But the fact that Tolkien wrote this other final song where it's Bilbo is now this song it moves from that to this new song, shows the transportation of Bilbo, of the years falling off of him, right? He's now past the old talk. He's quite old and withered, frankly, when he shows up at the end of The Lord of the Rings to go onto the boat. But this song is the song of it grows with youth and vigor over the course of the song. And he's saying, farewell, friends, my time has come. And it's time to pass to the lands east of the moon, west of the sun. And he's going, and we're going to go away. Farewell, now I'm off to Elvenhome, where and even mentions things like, where what I don't know what it is, but where sleep is rest. As we get older, sleep is actually less restful and less restorative. We don't sleep as well. Something always hurts and aches, so you got to pee a couple of times. Be getting old.
Yeah.
And so this notion that where sleep is rest and things are bright and green and lands forever blessed. And the fact that Tolkien adds this in, like Bilbo's story isn't done with waiting by the fire, thinking of the things that'll come when he won't ever see again. The story ends with Bilbo going to a blessed land of greenery and peace and rest, like when you were, not the rest of death, but the rest of youth, right? Lying on the grass under the sun, falling asleep, and being fully refreshed.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
and to me,
and that's at the
just
end of the
very
Lord of the Rings.
different. And it's not included in Lord of the Rings, but chronologically, that's where this poem takes place. It comes from the rest from his other sundry works. But I think that's an argument against the notion that, well, everything's just enchantments leaving the world. No, he doesn't even leave Bilbo that way. He doesn't even leave Bilbo that way.
Yeah, that's interesting to point out here too. Tolkien, I've always maintained that Tolkien, of all the 20th century writers I've read, is probably the most hopeful, if not maybe even the only hopeful 20th century writer. And all these other writers that are espoused as great writers by literary critics and by faculties in various colleges, they're depressing as hell. They may be good writers, but they're all there. There's no sense that there's anything awaiting us besides just a yogurt cup in the afternoon as we dribble on ourselves most of the day, sitting in our wheelchair, and eventually, we just pass out there in the nursing home. That's like the hope that most all modern writers have, and that's not Tolkien. In this image that you just brought up, he's confirming the idea that this is not the end, and certainly old age and having your bedpans changed by a nurse is not the end. And I can't help but think that to a great degree this does two things. One, it is a response to the age-old problem that the Norse reflected on, which is how do you face death? How do you face defeat? something that Tolkien was very aware of. He had studied the Norse mythology and had translated several of the works of Old English. And so he was aware that what their constant theme was that a person's character is determined by how they face ultimate defeat. Now, it's not your character's not determined by how many likes you have, for instance, on the internet, or how often, how well you dress or whatever. It's determined by how in the worst situation, how do you respond? Do you respond positively with courage and with hope and with continuing to maintain what you know to be good, or do you abandon it all and say, "Oh, to hell with it, chuck this for a lark," so to speak? Because that's really that's the test of character in the Norse mythology. But the other thing that it does is it gives the response to that very problem that was so attractive to the Norse people, which is the response of the Christian message. The North people converted in large swaths to Christianity. Now, granted, most of it was to what came to be called a heretical branch of Christianity later on, but nevertheless, they responded to it because they saw this as the ultimate response, the sacrifice of Christ, and then the resurrection and the movement into the blessed realm of heaven. That was for them a perfectly adequate response to this problem. And they gravitated to it like gravitating to water. And so for later Norse thinkers and writers and artists, Christianity is deeply interwoven into their works. It's integral. I would say even as far back as the poem Beowulf, there's an integral nature of Christianity wrapped into what's being composed in that poem. And I think Tolkien's doing the same thing here. It's why I think his message of hope is so inextricable from his message of Christianity. It's like the two are very tightly wound together. You could even say they are the same message. So you can't strip Tolkien of his Christian elements. And indeed he himself says so. He says that this is not, I don't remember the exact wording, but he says this is not an analog for Christianity, nor is it a propaganda for Christianity, but it is a deeply Christian and particularly Catholic story. Tolkien's own words in his letters are about that. And as a side note, it brings up this podcast I was listening to just the other day, which is called Tolkien Road, I think it was. And this fellow, really interesting guy, has been doing it for 7 years, but he had a negative comment where the comment was basically that his program was a propaganda for Christianity, and Tolkien's was also propaganda for Christianity, and that there really shouldn't be any Christianity in the work at all because it's basically a piece of fantasy. And he was trying to respond to that, and he did an adequate job of responding. I don't think there was anything wrong with it. But what I think he didn't recognize was that he's dealing with a bot. He's dealing with a human who has become a bot, or else an actual bot machine. And I think that whole phenomenon is becoming ubiquitous right now, where there is a movement, I don't know what we would call it necessarily, but is a movement that is trying to strip Christianity and the images of Christianity from everything, including this most phenomenal writer of the 20th century, which I think is not just, it's blasphemous and it's wrong and it's ill-headed, but it's also really defeatist. Because if, for instance, you do strip this work of its Christianity and its hopeful message, well, what are you left with? You're left with the same bloody thing that you get in every other work of the 20th century, which is this sadness and misery and sorrow is all we have to look forward to. We don't have any blessed at all.
Right.
So I'm sorry to soapbox for so long, but it does anger me a bit when I see it over and over again playing out in our current era. And I can't help but think that it's an attempt to bring everybody under the control of the machine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what it is. I think absolutely, it is 100% that. We want to wants to cover the world in a second darkness, and it is. It really is. It's let's get rid of, good riddance. The elves are all leaving. Let's get rid of the last bits of them that exist and bring everything under the machine. And they are advocates for the machine. They're advocates for the machine even conquering the human body, the human form, either by augmentation or by replacement. It's all the same piece, and I think it's very Saruman. It's very much the voice of Saruman, of the Sauron, for that matter. Of the dark power,
Yeah,
take over.
yeah.
That seems very clear.
And we go back for a minute to what we talked about when we talked about the formation of orcs. You
Hmm.
know, how if you're a creature whose primary juice, stuff, fuel is love, because that's
Hmm.
what elves are. They're essentially creatures of love. Everything that emerges from them is emerging out of love.
Hmm.
How would you? What would be the most effective thing to torture a creature like that? I mean, this may be a little sick to think about this, but we talked about how Morgoth Melkor twists the elves physically, but he also twists them emotionally, spiritually, mentally. The most
Hmm.
effective thing would be to twist that image of love and say, there is no such thing. It's hopeless. There's no point.
Exactly. It's just
Love itself
darkness.
is just juices squirting in the head, or the gland.
Hmm.
Um, and I think the same can be
Right.
said for human beings. How do you make orcs? You make them this way.
Yep.
You take this
Yeah.
greatest of works and you twist it around so that it's nothing more than one among many other crappy 20th century works, and it has no real Christian or hopeful message. It is just a piece of literature, badly written with bad poetry, right?
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
maybe that's a long ways away from what we're talking about, but um, I think it's important to note because I wonder if that isn't what we are about to see here with Feanor and what we also see in the character of Galadriel.
Hmm.
She comes up here in a few pages for the first time,
Right.
and I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this without going off on Amazon again. But her character is one who deals with this hopelessness and despair for thousands of years. And when we see her in the Lord of the Rings, of course, it's much much later. Because she's here at the very start of this business.
Hmm.
And so there's never a point where she's sort of a Mary Sue, where she's just this kick-ass troll killing type that just has to realize how beautiful she is. That doesn't happen.
Hmm.
So the
If.
twisting of her into that in Amazon, I think, is part of this whole business of twisting around Tolkien stuff so that it
Hmm.
doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But yeah, okay, I'll
I
stop.
mean, you see, if anything, she's aware from the beginning that she's the most beautiful of the children of the elves. That's made explicit. Now we're not in that chapter yet, and that's that. Like she has flaws, and they are kind of more around her um, vanity of some sort, and a
Mm,
deep pride, like in a not narcissistic pride, but the kind of pride that gets you into trouble,
mm,
and you make some pig-headed choices. And well, we'll get, that's in future chapters where we really see Galadriel become a protagonist, and it's a very different Galadriel than the much more aged Galadriel of Lothlorien.
mhm.
But she is mentioned here uh, um, as we get into when we get into the it's not really a genealogy, the introductions of
Mm,
specific members of the Noldor. Because the Vanyar fade out. There's one last mention of Elwë Singollo. He
right.
eventually awakes from his long trance and he comes forth with Melian, right? And they dwell together. And he's been transformed into a lord of the Maiar. So
Mm,
he too, it's not only that the two of them, you know, Melian, the Maya, and Elwë Singollo somehow come together, and then Luthien Tinuviel, their daughter, is half goddess, half elf. But in their
mm,
mingling, they've mingled their natures as well. So she's more elvish now, and he is more divine now. And a high doom was upon him, and he was the
yeah,
tallest and noblest of the children of Iluvatar. And his hair was a
yeah,
gray silver and all of that. And then his story will pick up later.
yeah.
Um, but the Teleri, now this is important for the later plot, which involves Galadriel, almost bringing them to the Blessed Islands, but then has some second thoughts. And he leaves the island in the bay of Valinor. He doesn't join the Teleri fully to Valinor. Now, the Valar are upset with him for having done this, but his ways are mystical ways, and he, second only to um, Help me out, the big guy.
Second
Second
only
only to the
to,
chief god.
oh, yeah,
Uh,
right.
what's his anyway? Manwë? Manwë.
Manwë,
Second
right,
only to
Manwë.
Manwë has a close he's closest to the thought of Iluvatar. He's got the closest access to the mind of Iluvatar. Second only to Manwë. Ulmo does, right? Though be in a deeper and more mystical way. And he decides to leave the island of the Teleri there, and that's Tol Eressëa. It's in
Hmm.
sight of Valinor, but it's not completely joined to Valinor. That becomes significant even when we come to the world of men. You have somebody like Earendil. But here they are, and this accounts for the sundering of their language, their speech, from the speech of the Vanyar, the Noldor. And then they build a city, and actually there's an opportunity, I think in a chapter or two, to talk more about the city
Yeah.
itself. And we find out that the Vanyar, sort of to wrap their thread up, Manwë and Varda loved most the Vanyar, the fair elves, because they dwelt really, in fact, the Vanyar go and they dwell among the Valar most intimately. The Noldor dwell nearby, still in Valinor, but they don't really kind of mingle so much in the households of the Valar. And so they learn various skills and knowledge and crafts. They learn from Aule, and this,
Mm-hmm.
we'll see a little bit more and more of this. But this accounts for a lot of the stories that we have, that the ancient civilizations have, of origins of arts, sciences, music, crafts, above all, among men, is we're taught in some way by the gods, right? By
Mm-hmm.
these celestial spirits. And this is essentially the elvish version of that. And then we talk about the Nold, then that transitions to the Noldor, who afterwards come back to Middle Earth. This tale tells mostly of their deeds, and that is why the names and kinship of their princes may here be told in that form which the names
Mm-hmm.
later bore in the tongue of the elves of Beleriand, and that's where we get Finwë, Feanor, all the F names, and then also, of course, Galadriel. And so
Yeah,
it does introduce the kin and all of that. And I think there is so much material here to dive into
I think
that
we should pause it and take
that'll
that
have
next
to
time.
come in the next episode, because that will flow directly. So the introduction of these individuals flows into, we make a transition at this point, or the Silmarillion makes a transition at this point from sort of these mythic transitions and origins of people, with a few personal stories, little vignettes along the way, transitions into more of a plot-driven kind of tale.
Mm-hmm.
There's,
Mm-hmm.
these particular people doing these particular things with massive ramifications, and all the merry mix-ups that occur along the way. And so we're at a
Yeah.
at a pivoting point, which is interesting. It's an axial point in the story, as this island, just shifting from this island moving, which is in many ways an axis point, um, and serves as a sort of mystical axial spot between Valar and the realms of Middle Earth.
Mm.
In fact, even between Valinor and Numenor, as we'll see later on, this Tol
Mm.
Eressëa becomes the point which is allowed to be seen.
One of the beautiful things about Tolkien is that his work deeply involves longing for beauty, love of beauty. It's a work that is made out of love, expresses love, and the great the great composer of John Tavener, 20th century composer John Tavener, used to say that all music, all art came out of this type of love, this longing, as he called it, eros, which is a longing for something beautiful. That's the ancient world definition of eros. It's not just sexual love. It's the longing for that thing that you've missed. And I just want to conclude this episode by pointing that out in this early part of this chapter, this early part of the book, in two passages. One is here at the end, talking about Elwë, where Elwë, it says, lingers because greatly though he had desired to see again the light of the trees, in the face of Melian he beheld the light of Aman as in an unclouded mirror, and in that light he was content. So Elwë, Thingol, decides to stay there in Beleriand, Middle Earth, because of the longing. He has a longing to see this gorgeous light of the trees, which is a longing for heaven in a way. But he is also content with this beautiful creature, this woman, this demigoddess that he has fallen in love with, and he's perfectly content to be there. And so the longing is sort of fulfilled in this image of rapturous connection between the two. But then that same longing comes up later on where it says that to these the Valar had given a land and a dwelling place, right, to the Noldor. But even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they, the Noldor, longed still at times to see the stars, and therefore a gap was made in the great walls of the Pelari. And there in a deep valley that ran down to the sea, the Eldar raised a high green hill called Tuna. So the very creation of this hill, which then becomes the city of Tirion, is due primarily to a longing, a desire, a love that these elves, the Noldor, have. Because I love the line, among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, the radiant gardens, right? The radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens. That's a great image and one that speaks of great beauty. And you can feel the longing for that. But at the same time, the Noldor have a longing to see the stars because you can't see them when you have these beautiful bright trees because they're too bright. So longing itself and desire and love are things that end up creating art and creating beauty and drawing us towards the beautiful itself. As Dante points out, you are drawn by love into the stars themselves, into the image of light and heaven, and and you can't extract that Christian image and still have the same work. This work is all about love and desire and longing and what it does for people and what it does to people as well. So I'm going to conclude, I think, with just that reflection. If the turning point is, if this is a mystic turning point from the realms of mystical creation to the practical storyline that we're going to get next, I wonder if that pivot point isn't on the pivot point of desire and longing, of love, that somehow the whole work pivots on how does love prompt a person? Not just that how do you face death, but how does death itself get incorporated by love into the very natural process of being alive? So we'll quit there. And to Dr. Thompson and to everyone else who is listening or watching, farewell wherever you fare. Your Aries receive you at the journey's end.